Okay, so we are very happy to have one of our former colleagues here, Leonard Basobas, with us. He is currently the Director of Growth and Development for the Emergency Medicine Clinical Research Unit. He used to be at SCCR prior to that. Leonard has over 20 years of experience in the field of clinical research. He was a senior research manager at Stanford Center for Clinical Research, as I mentioned, and study lead and senior project manager at various academic institutions, contract research organizations, and large healthcare systems and also in the private sectors. Leonard has extensive experience successfully building and managing cross-functional teams and training and developing staff in accordance with good clinical practice and federal regulations. And thank you so much, Leonard, for being here. And we really appreciate your time and expertise. And we also have my colleague, my boss, Kiera Davis here. She's going to introduce herself, but she is the Associate Director of Education and Training at Stanford Center for Clinical Research. So Kiera, you would like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, there's not really much else to say. That is my role. I've been at Stanford now for over 7 years. Previous pediatric cardiac ICU nurse, working in various hospitals across the country, both at Duke and then as a travel nurse. And then I started my career in clinical research as a clinical research coordinator at Duke, working primarily in infectious disease and a lot of pulmonary trials with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. So I've worked in clinical research now for over 10 years and have some clinical experience as well. And hopefully one day, although I really like Zoom, this is nice, I hope to one day actually get back to in-person trainings. We had our GCP boot camp, which was great. We had about 60 learners in collaboration with Spectrum. So it was wonderful to be in person and see people and meet people and interact in person. I didn't really realize how much I missed that. So hopefully we can, it's nice that we have access to this. I know many of us are working remote, but it would be wonderful to see everybody in person. Hopefully that happens in 2023. So I will kick us off here and share my slides. Leonard and I are going to be doing a little bit of a tag team back and forth this morning. Here's our agenda. We're going to just briefly talk about GCP, what it is, why we follow it, just to make sure everybody's on the same playing field before getting into some of the guidelines, as well as discussion about some of the codified regulations around specifically PI responsibilities. I'm going to talk briefly about the clinical research ecosystem, and then we're going to talk more about these roles and responsibilities of some site team members, including CRCs. We'll mention a couple other players involved. We're going to talk a decent amount about delegation of authority, just because that's where our responsibilities are documented. And then Leonard's going to talk more about the responsibilities of the PI. So I have a couple of learning objectives. These come from the Joint Task Force domain, section 4.2. And so by the end of this course, this class today, we would like you to be able to describe the role of yourself, the role that you play in the conduct of research, and others. So we're not going to talk about everybody, but we're going to try to hit on at least a few of the site team members. And these are both according to regulations and to GCP guidelines, and then to understand the concept of delegation of authority and scope of practice. So for many who've been working in clinical research, you're probably familiar with the definition of GCP, but for those who are newer to research, we wanted to just, again, even out the playing field and make sure we're all aware of what GCP is and why it's important that we follow it. So the definition, and this is according to the ICH guidelines, which is the International Conference on Harmonization, Good Clinical Practice. And this is an international ethical and scientific quality standard for designing, conducting, recording, and reporting trials that involve the participation of human subjects. So E6 has to do with human subjects. There's a lot of other guidelines that ICH has created over many years. Manufacturing is one. Let's see, I wrote another comment, pharmaceutical quality systems. So just to give you an idea, ICH doesn't just do human subjects, but E6 has to do with human subjects specifically, and that's obviously what we're going to be talking about. R2 is revision 2. So the second revision of this guideline was published in 2016. So pretty recent. They did make some updates from the previous guideline. And it's important, obviously, that there is compliance. This is a guideline, it's not a regulation, but it is something that's been adopted by the FDA, and it was adopted by the FDA in 2016. So compliance with this standard provides public assurance that the right, safety, and well-being of trial subjects are protected, consistent with the principles that have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki, and that the clinical trial data are credible. Declaration of Helsinki formed a lot of the basic ethical principles for conduct with clinical trial subjects, participants. And if you're not familiar with that, please read through it. It's something that any person working in clinical research should be familiar with. So the objective of ICH GCP E6R2 is to provide a unified standard for the EU, Japan, and the United States to facilitate the mutual acceptance of clinical data by regulatory authorities in these jurisdictions. The guideline was developed by these three countries in the EU, as well as Australia, Canada, the Nordic countries, and the World Health Organization. I mentioned earlier that it was adopted by the FDA in November of 2016 as a guidance, but it should be followed when generating clinical trial data where that data is intended to be submitted to regulatory authorities. If you have never looked at ICH GCP E6R2, again, it's not all that long of a document. You're looking at roughly about 60 pages. Certainly not every page. I wouldn't review it at every single page. Well, at some point, I think it's important to review every page. But the sections, for instance, there's a lot of glossary terms in section 1. So if you're curious about the definitions of some of these terms, they're listed right there in section 1. And interestingly enough, we're going to talk about this a little later, but there is no definition for a coordinator. According to ICH GCP, just an interesting kind of caveat to this discussion today. Section 2 are the 13 principles of GCP. So again, working. That we discussed from here to someone's not on mute. I'm getting some background. So if you're talking, so that's all I did. You could go ahead and maybe mute yourself. I think I found the person who was talking. Okay. Again, being familiar with the IRB and what those guidelines are, because we all work with IRBs. We're going to talk a lot about section 4 today with the investigator. They have sections on the sponsor, clinical trial protocol and amendments, the IB. And then one other section that I would draw your attention to is the essential documents for the conduct of clinical trials. That's section 8. On the agenda, I mentioned just a brief kind of overview of this ecosystem. We have a lot of different individuals and groups and companies and businesses, regulatory agencies involved in clinical research. So you guys are probably very familiar with at least some form of this diagram, but kind of at the middle here is the PI and the clinical research team. So I should have added plus the site team as well, because we're all integral members of the conduct of research at a site. But here we have the PI and we interact with research participants. We're interacting with either the site IRB or a central IRB. Maybe we're working with a contract research organization. We may or may not be working with hospital clinics. Most likely we are if we're enrolling patients from our Stanford institution, obviously. We may be working with vendors, various vendors, labs, for instance. And then obviously, if it's a sponsor-initiated study, we're interacting a lot with that sponsor, and the sponsor would be responsible for interacting with the FDA. If it's a PI-initiated study and PIs are acting as a sponsor, obviously we would have communication and working directly with the FDA as well. So what does the site team look like? This is not meant to be a comprehensive list, but just kind of setting the stage of these could be a few key members of our team. We have the principal investigator. We may have a sub-investigator or multiple sub-investigators. I know many of you today are CRCs or maybe even research nurses. Sometimes we have assistant clinical research coordinators, data managers, and then you may be working, if it's an investigational product, you may or may not be working with an investigational pharmacist. So again, this isn't meant to be fully comprehensive, but these are a few of our key members from the site level. And now I'm going to stop sharing and let Leonard take over for the next handful of slides to talk more about CFRs and investigator responsibilities. Oh, you're on mute, Leonard.
There we go. Thanks, Kiera. I hope everyone can hear me now. But, as we mentioned, from this GCP and our topic today is really talking about the roles and responsibilities of the investigators and the clinical research coordinators. But I kind of wanted to start here because as we kind of get in, especially for the roles of the investigator, which I'll go into here very shortly, there's going to be a lot of reference back to the Code of Federal Regulations, okay? And I just kind of want to, based on, the next couple of slides, kind of demystify, at least for a lot of people who may not be familiar with the Code of Federal Regulations and or kind of hear time and time again, us who won't say necessarily who are more experienced, but who've actually delved into these processes a little bit more, here like 21 Part 50, things of that nature, and kind of wonder what that means. So our Code of Federal Regulations, so the requirements right now for conducting clinical studies. Okay, they outline the responsibilities, again, as Kiera mentioned, for the sponsors, investigators, and IRB, okay? And this really involves research with human subjects. And strangely enough, for us, it's federal law. Okay, so it actually does have the power of law. Most times, if we breach that, there are some serious consequences, as we might get into later. With regard to CFR organization, again, just want to demystify a little bit as far as the type of nomenclature. If you take the first part, Part 21 or Title 21, you can see it just follows a simple organization from title to chapters to part to subparts to paragraph. If you really want to boil down, for example, in this case, Title 21 really has to deal, again, it's part in this chapter of under food and drugs. Part 50 is actually looking at protection of human subjects. And if we keep drilling down and we're really looking at our subpart and trying to find out more information on what the law is with regard to informed consents of human subjects, we'd really start looking at Part B and all these different elements. As I mentioned, there's going to be some federal regulations that I think everybody who's involved in clinical research needs to know. Part 11 deals with electronic records and electronic signatures. Part 50 deals with protection of human subjects. 54 deals with financial disclosures. Part 50 deals with IRBs. And you'll see the next two, highlighted rather heavily when I talk about investigators in Part 312, which refers to drugs simply, or investigational new drugs, or Part 812, which deals with investigational investigational device exemptions. Okay, so devices primarily. Okay, so as far as the role of an investigator, as outlined in ICH E6R2, we're really looking at Section 4. And as you can see here, it's broken down into multiple parts, but each one deals with a specific responsibility that an investigator should be taking during a clinical trial. Okay. And as we'll get into a lot of these a little bit later on, but just to highlight qualification agreements, making sure that we have adequate resources, the medical care of any trial subjects, communication back to the IRB or some type of ethics committee, compliance to the protocol, making sure that they have some control or responsibility over the investigational product, randomization procedures and unblinding, informed consent of trial subjects, records and reports, progress reports, safety reporting, any parts of premature termination or suspension of a trial, and final reports by the investigator. Okay. Now, as far as the definition, oh, my apologies there, of principal investigator, and it's actually an individual who conducts a clinical investigation. And in the event an investigation is conducted by a team, the investigator is basically responsible for leading that team. The clinical investigator is in charge and held accountable primarily. The FDA regulations permit sponsors to delegate their responsibilities to contract research organizations or CROs, but do not permit clinical investigators to delegate their responsibilities to CROs or site management organizations, sub-investigators, or study staff. Kiera will actually get into that a little bit more here when we talk about our delegation of authority of what actually is permissible and what type of activities that an investigator may actually delegate. If you take a look, basically a large overview of what a principal investigator and what their responsibilities are, going from left to right, basically ensure that the clinical investigation is conducted according to the IRB approved protocol and all applicable regulations, protect the safety of the participants, controls the investigational products, has sufficient time to conduct the study, and has access to other resources, for example, space, money, equipment, staff, etc. And we'll get into that a little bit later as we discuss staff. And as you know, for the last part, I mean, primarily they're ultimately responsible for the conduct of the clinical study. So general responsibilities of an investigator is outlined in 21 CFR 312.60. An investigator is responsible for ensuring that an investigation is conducted according, to the signed investigator statement in 312, and when we're dealing with drugs, that often amounts to looking at the 1572, the investigational plan, often referred to as our protocol, and any applicable regulations for protecting the rights, safety, and welfare of subjects under the investigator's care, and for the control of drug under investigation. The investigator shall, in accordance with the provisions of Part 50 of this chapter, obtain the informed consent, as we saw earlier, to whom the drug is administered, except as provided in Parts 50.23 or 50.24 of this chapter. Additional specific responsibilities of the clinical investigator are set forth in this part and in Part 50 and 56. As I mentioned earlier, another big responsibility for the investigators is compliance with the protocol. And as we can see here from some of these highlighted texts, I won't belabor you by reading off the slide because some of it's very dense. But if you look at the very highlighted portions, right, they're really responsible for the conduct of the trial and making sure that everything is in compliance with the protocol. And in that case, the next 3 bullet points make perfect sense, right? They should not implement any deviations from or changes of the protocol without agreement by the sponsor and previous review and documented approval / favorable opinion from an IRB or IEC. And they should document and explain any deviations from the approved protocol. Now, interestingly enough, an investigator may implement a deviation from and/or a change in the protocol to eliminate and immediate hazards to the trial subjects without prior IRB, IEC approval or / favorable opinion. I won't get into that now. That definitely is another topic for expanded conversation. But just to know that that is permissible at certain times and for very specific studies. As we kind of use the standard answer, especially in clinical research, at times when you're very uncertain, especially which way a rule and or a regulation may be favoring. Obviously, it depends. There are going to be certain circumstances and situations that obviously we might have a guidance and or a regulation tied to. As I mentioned earlier, the PI is also responsible for the safety of each one of the subjects. So how is that done? By actually, collecting and reporting any type of safety issues. And we see this in ICH E6R2 section 411. Okay, just to highlight, when we really talk about serious adverse events, they should be reported immediately. The investigator should comply with applicable regulatory requirements, and any any adverse event and or laboratory abnormalities identified in the protocol as critical to safety evaluation should be reported to the sponsor. Any deaths, the investigator should supply the sponsor and or the IRB with any additional requested information. For example, autopsy reports and terminal medical reports. The investigator is also responsible for the control of any investigational drugs according to 312.61. The investigator shall administer the drug only to subjects under the investigator's personal supervision or under the supervision of a sub-investigator responsible to the investigator. The investigator shall not supply the investigational drug to any person not authorized under this part to receive it. Now, as we tie all of those federal regulations, some of those aspects, and we bring it back to our GCP document, ICH E6R2, I want to really point out, with this second revision, some of the addendums, especially when it relates to investigators' responsibilities. As you can see here in 4.2.5 and 4.2.6, they've really made it an emphasis with this last revision to really kind of pull out, if you can look at the two highlight sections, supervising and ensuring these individuals or parties qualified, really managing the teams. In accordance, when we kind of look at investigators, you might actually hear, multiple terms thrown out. For example, I used the word clinical investigator previously, just plain investigator, principal investigator, designate who might lead the study. But there also are specific guidelines and or regulations tied to sponsor investigator. And what does that mean? It really refers back to an individual who both initiates and conducts alone or with others a clinical trial and under whose immediate direction the investigational product is administered to, dispensed to, and or used by a subject. Okay. Now, what's interesting here, if you look at the highlighted text, the obligations of a sponsor investigator includes both those of the sponsor and those of the investigator. So we're not necessarily even just talking again with just E6, R2 part or section 4 that deals with investigator, but we're now actually referring to all of the responsibilities that a sponsor may have to undertake in section 5. Okay. Now, the definition of a sponsor investigator is actually detailed, a more substantial one in the glossary in section 1.54. The term does not apply or does not include any person other than an individual. And the requirements applicable to a sponsor investigator, again, as mentioned, include both those applicable to an investigator and a sponsor according to our federal regulations. Okay. Another responsibility that falls underneath the principal investigator and or investigator is record keeping and retention according to the regulations. So what does that mean? Maintaining adequate records of the disposition of the drug, accurate case histories that record all observations. So as we'll see here, clearly, if you haven't heard this before in all of your clinical research experience and or training, document, right? That's what we're looking for. And other data pertinent to the investigation on each individual administered the investigational drug or employed as a control in the investigation. An investigator is required to maintain investigational records for 2 years following the date a marketing application is approved for the drug for the indication for which it is being investigated, or 2 years after the investigation is discontinued and FDA is notified if no application is to be filed or if the application has not been approved for such indication. The investigator is also responsible, as we mentioned, for reporting. So they have specific investigator reports according to their federal regulations, supplying progress reports to the sponsor, obviously safety reports, so immediate reporting of any adverse event that's alarming. So that includes any unexpected event that is serious or life-threatening. and also to record serious record non-serious adverse events and report them to the sponsor according to their timetable for reporting specified in the protocol. They're also responsible for submitting final reports to the sponsor. Also, some type of documentation and reports regarding financial disclosure. And these, especially for our FDFs or financial disclosure forms, need to properly update those as needed throughout the course of the investigation, and up to 1 year following the completion of an investigation. An investigator also needs to, again, comply and make sure that the IRB that they're actually utilizing actually complies with all the applicable regulations. So, as noted, an investigator shall assure that an IRB that complies with the requirements set forth in Part 56 will be responsible for the initial and continuing review and approval of the proposed clinical study. The clinical investigator shall also assure that he or she will promptly report to the IRB all changes in the research activity and all unanticipated problems involving risks to human subjects or others, and that he or she will not make any changes to the research without IRB approval, except where necessary to eliminate apparent immediate hazards to the human subjects. Another part of record keeping is actually opening your files up and making sure that if anybody is asking for or to inspect your records, that, and according to, again, 312.68, that an investigator shall, upon request from any properly authorized officer or employee of FDA at reasonable times, permit such officer or employee to have access to and copy and verify any records or reports made by an investigator pursuant to 312.62. The investigator is not required to divulge any subject names unless the records of particular individuals require more detailed study of the cases, or unless there is a reason to believe that records do not represent actual case studies or do not represent actual results obtained. As noted before, one of the primary, especially when we're dealing with drugs, one of the primary responsibilities of the investigator too is handling of controlled substances. If the investigational drug is subject to any to the Controlled Substances Act, the investigator shall take adequate precautions, including storage of the investigational drug in a secured, locked, substantially constructed cabinet or securely locked, substantially constructed enclosure, access to which is limited to prevent theft or diversion of the substance into illegal channels of distribution. So when we try to encapsulate all of what we've kind of discussed according to the federal regulations, and also with our ICH GCP documents, we're really talking about responsible conduct, okay? And as part of the investigative responsibility, especially qualifying them, it's actually just more than completing a training for the investigators. They actually have to basically be responsible for actually knowing, understanding, and following all these regulations and guidances. So here are just a few below that we've highlighted. So obviously GCP standards, according to E6 R2, some of these, if not all of these, applicable Code of Federal Regulations. Also with the common rule, which is 45 CFR, which really deals with human subjects research, any aspects of clinicaltrial.gov, genetic research and other specialized research, obviously HIPAA privacy, state and local laws, and or university and hospital policies. So if we kind of look at that same as far as the qualifications, and we really go back to our good clinical practice document, under 4.1, where it really goes down the line of really identifying what type of qualifications an investigator needs to run a study. So we were really looking at three primary parameters here: education, training, and experience. And interestingly enough, the document specifies that they should meet all of those qualifications, okay? And should provide evidence to the fact, okay? So what are we talking about here? Up-to-date curriculum vitae, and or any other relevant documentation requested by the sponsor, the IRB, IEC, and or other regulatory authorities. Now, all of this, as far as GCP and all of our federal regulations, I mean, they do have their basic in ethics, especially for the fourth general principle of the Declaration of Helsinki, okay, which really specifies that the duty of the physician is to promote and safeguard the health, well-being, and rights of patients, including those who are involved in medical research. The physician's knowledge and conscience are dedicated to the fulfillment of this study or this duty. The ethical principle is basically, again, as we mentioned, codified in federal and state laws, meaning the CRF, detailed in standards and guidances such as GCP. And if the clinical research is conducted by an individual other than a physician, the responsibilities are the same. So I wanted to really bring this back really to the first slide. When we talk about GCP, as you can see here, here is a standard definition. What's important for all of you to grasp when you read this, look at all the different actual activities within this definition alone, right? Design, conduct, performance, monitoring. It encapsulates every single activity that is from startup to closeout of your trial, okay? But, you know, that may seem on the surface, you know, again, obviously, maybe too encompassing, but if we really break down good clinical practice to its bare bones, we're really looking at ethics and quality data, okay? Data integrity and ethical treatment of participants. So we've gotten to the point where we're just gonna have a very quick, you know, Zoom response here. And for a quick question, just to kind of test your knowledge based on some of the items that we've discussed so far. You know, quick poll: is the investigator of a clinical study required to have a medical license? We'll just give that a few minutes before we end the poll.
Should I end the poll? I guess we have 80% response.
Yeah, 80%.
That's good, huh? So
Yeah.
I'll end it here and share the results. Do you see the results?
Mm-hmm.
Can everyone see that? So it looks like 59% say yes and 41% no. Oh, backtrack a little bit. Let me close that out.
Yeah, and the point about that slide really, or that question was,
Okay.
Dentists can actually be PIs, right? Depending on the trial, what they're looking at. So while that's not technically a medical, they do have some sort of medical license, but it's not the same as a medical doctor. Yeah,
so I think, as Kiera mentioned, again, a lot of these questions will really go back to, that standard answer that we have in clinical research, right? It depends. It depends, obviously, what type of clinical study or clinical research study is being undertaken, and whether it falls within these applicable regulations and or who might have been identified as the investigator or qualified as the investigator. Okay. Any questions or comments on that?
Carlos has a question in the chat. If you want to take that, Leonard, while if you want to stop sharing, I can reshare my screen.
Sure, absolutely. Let me see that.
So
yeah,
the question says by
Carlos,
medical, you mean either MD or PhD, correct?
That's correct. I mean, but again, like it's really interesting because I think, depending upon where you might qualify and again, who may necessarily be running the study, Carlos, again, really depends. I know I've not necessarily at our institution, but I know there's been some other individuals. And again, some of these may not involve like any type of drug. But, as far as some nurses, as far as their licenses and things of that nature. But when we're really looking at, the definition here of a clinical research study, especially within the slide set, we're looking at drugs and devices. And we're really looking at those 312 and 812. So yes, it definitely would be a medical license for the MD.
Yeah, and that just has to do with safety, right? So a PhD, or an individual with a PhD obviously has a lot of information, but they may not be clinically trained, right? So they can't be able to assess or even assess eligibility or safety concerns. So, but if there's a PI for a non-investigational study, that is absolutely allowed to have a PhD running, a non-investigational study, population health, something like that.
Yeah, that's definitely correct. But no, great question.
And yes, Monica, it can be a DO, MD or DO. So I'm gonna take over for a few, and we're gonna talk a little bit about delegation of authority. So I want to say there, I do have a future slide, but there's an interesting delegation of authority really comes from the FDA rather than ICH-DCP. There is no mention of delegation of authority in the guideline. They do have something called a signature sheet, but that really has to do with who can complete CRFs, case report forms. So when we talk about delegation of authority, this is something that's coming from the FDA. And as most of you, many of you I know are CRCs or other members of the research team. But this is a document that's often completed by the CRC, and that's fine. But I want to remind you all that this is something that the PI has to sign. They should sign each line, and we'll go over some best practices. But just make sure this is a document that you review. If you are the one completing it, you review that document line by line with the PI, just to ensure that everything's been completed correctly, because this is a document showing responsibility, who's taking responsibility for the study related tasks. So if you are completing it, make sure that you are very familiar with the protocol, the informed consent, the schedule of events for your study, and completion, and how the CRFs need to be completed. You need to understand each task that has been delegated to you. If there are any questions, you obviously need to have that conversation with the PI. If you require additional training for administration of a survey or a questionnaire, obviously that training needs to be done and documented. We're going to talk a little bit later about documentation of training. I mentioned communicate concerns with the investigator, obtain training that you need to correctly and safely conduct tasks, and obviously make sure all of that training is documented. So we're going to talk now a little bit about site team responsibilities, and these are really any team member, study personnel that performs duties according to their scope of practice based on their licensure or certification. This can be different depending on state to state. So licensure and certification is, may be different from California to other states. So being aware of that is important. According to the guidelines, the investigator should maintain a list of appropriately qualified persons to whom the investigator has delegated these tasks. And this is where the DOA comes in. So this is really the document that we are speaking of, even with the guidelines. It's not specifically outlined in the guidelines as a delegation of authority, but this is how it should be documented according to the FDA, as well as according to the regs and guidelines. The investigator is responsible for supervising any individual party to whom the investigator delegates the tasks. Obviously, proper delegation is very important. You can't, haphazardly just assign people to things. There's only, certain things that people can do. For instance, I'm a nurse. I have an active license in California. If I was on a study, I can do certain things by license that other people cannot, right? So I could, for instance, draw blood, and a phlebotomist obviously can do that. If I had a BSN though, right? Like I have a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, which I do, but say my license lapsed in the state of California. That doesn't mean just because I have a BSN, I can go and draw blood now. So this is according to training, education, licensure, maybe a certification, and then of course, experience. So determining who's authorized to perform the study related tasks really is up to the discretion of the principal investigator, but that has to be documented. And that's why we collect things like, CVs and medical licenses, RN licenses, respiratory therapist licenses, phlebotomists, et cetera. So I mentioned earlier the sub-investigator. So there is a definition for a sub-investigator in the guideline. And this is any individual member of the clinical trial team designated and supervised by the investigator at a trial site to perform critical trial-related procedures and or make important trial-related decisions. So a really good example of this is, say, a pathologist. So the pathologist has been brought in as a sub-investigator to review biopsies of lung tissue to confirm diagnosis. So this would be considered a sub-investigator of the study. Another example is a radiologist, and either one of these may also have other roles, but those are the two that I can really think of. Some people have asked about a co-investigator. Co-investigator is actually not recognized by the FDA, but they do say, yes, this can be helpful in some circumstances. If they are listed as a co-investigator, they need to sign a separate, for drugs, a 1572. And for devices, that would be investigator agreement. I mentioned earlier, as part of the member of the research team, data manager. So they're responsible for conducting delegated clinical research tasks using GCP. This may include transferring source data to the case report forms. Other team members may include investigational pharmacists. We may have designated lab staff, right? So if you're working, for instance, with the CTRU, they may be listed on the delegation of authority log. We're going to talk a little bit more about hospital nurses and techs. So if there is let's see, an echo tech or another ultrasound tech that has to perform study-related procedures on a participant, they would need to be listed on the DOA. So the next poll is coming up now. Should other team members, such as radiology techs, lab staff, and hospital nurses, be listed on the DOA? I'll give people just a couple more seconds to answer. So I do want to make sure we keep moving. So yeah, about, I know people are still answering. So yeah, like many things that we talk about, there are some gray areas, which is not, great when you're trying to learn things, but it really does depend. So like I mentioned earlier, hospital nurses become a little bit of an interesting situation when it comes to research. Oftentimes they aren't and should not be listed on a delegation of authority log, because if you have an inpatient clinical research study, for instance, and you are asking the clinical nurses to be added to a DOA, you could have a list very, very long, right? So nurses aren't necessarily dedicated to patients every day. And when it comes to things like completing city training, if they're performing clinical duties they should, they're not going to be listed on the DOA. There may be certain situations where there's an inpatient situation where there is going to be a nurse that's specifically dedicated to things like drawing, PK/PD labs, or administration of a drug where they're going to be involved, more than maybe a shift. Maybe that's a situation, but that's something that you would need to discuss with SHC, with the hospital and with their research team to make sure that that is accurate. And that's something that should be listed. I would say for other besides hospital, things like techs, lab staff, if they are performing study related procedures, then obviously they should be listed on the DOA. Danny asked, what about a pathologist who fills out a study-specific form to indicate the patient is eligible for trial? Would you need to add the pathologist to the DOA? Yes, because they are making the determination for part of the eligibility is made by the pathologist. Therefore, they're involved in the study. So yes, they would be added. They would need to be added to the DOA. Sure. Okay. I don't know if you guys saw that, the results or not. We will move on.
Yes, I shared.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the clinical research coordinator. So the clinical research coordinator aids in the coordination, management, and conduct of clinical research under the supervision of a PI. They're responsible for conducting delegated clinical research tasks using GCP. So this is not meant to be comprehensive of all the things. Leonard and I had a long discussion about what kind of information we wanted to include in this presentation. I have another presentation on kind of what it looks like for a CRC specifically at Stanford. And if you've worked at other institutions, you will see too that some responsibilities of CRCs at Stanford is different than responsibilities at other institutions. For instance, many CRCs are responsible for assisting with budgeting. This is not typically something, I wouldn't say typical, but it's not something across the board or is standard across all institutions. And so that is just different depending on where you're working. But this list is really meant to be, standard across the board. If you're working, especially at academic research institutions, you will be responsible for managing participant recruitment and enrollment, obviously obtaining informed consent, conducting some study-related procedures. So if you've been delegated to collect vital signs or check blood glucose, do a urine dipstick to check for pregnancy, even EKG, administration of EKGs. These are all tasks that can be delegated to CRCs, but you have to be properly trained, right? So anything that you have been delegated to, you have to understand how to do, show documentation of training. So things like obviously informed consent is really important. Like I mentioned, EKG training, glucose training, anything like that, anything that you're doing that's study related, just make sure that you, one, feel comfortable, two, have perhaps even the license to do so, and three, have documented training that you have received and feel comfortable doing whatever task has been delegated to you. Documentation of data collection, managing that data, and performing all regulatory duties. Sometimes CRCs are responsible for managing test article accountability. Depends, I know, and this is institution specific as well. Some institutions require an investigational pharmacist to be involved. This is not the case at Stanford. So you may be responsible for managing the investigational product, storing it, tracking it, making sure, dispensing it, things like that. Some other institutions will require use of investigational pharmacists. They did at Duke when I was there. Ensure integrity and compliance with regulatory and reporting requirements. Yeah, thank you, Nancy, for that comment. We do not add hospital nurses to our DOA. Their work on studies fall under their scope of practice. Yeah, thank you. So I mentioned this earlier. This is that signature sheet. This is the only, document or essential document that's mentioned in the ICH GCP around documentation of, well, I said earlier, this really only has to do with who's responsible for completing the case report forms. It doesn't list anything else. It just says, like I mentioned earlier, that investigators have to keep a list of who's involved in the study. And again, the way that we do that is through the DOA log. And again, the DOA is the process by which the PI is properly delegating study-related tasks and assessments to qualified staff. I mentioned this, keeping a list of appropriately assigned, appropriately qualified persons, and the investigator responsible for supervising any individual that's related in research. Okay, we'll move on to the next poll. What does it mean to be qualified to perform a study-related activity? This question actually is a little bit confusing, so my apologies. When I initially wrote it, it was select all that apply, but I think for this one, it's a single choice answer. So I won't give too much time to this.
Sorry, my bad.
No, it's fine.
Now that it should have been a multiple choices.
No worries. We'll just clarify here.
And unfortunately, I cannot edit it now, I guess. Thank you. Sorry about that.
The only wrong answer really is if the PI delegates a task, the study team must complete that task. So qualified may be by proper education, it may be by training, it may be by experience, it may be by licensure, so I should have added that. So really the only wrong one here is that if the PI delegates it, the study team member must complete. That is not the case, right? If the PI said, Leonard, you draw the blood, that is not an appropriate delegation. So they wouldn't complete that task, and they would go back to the PI and say, you know, I don't have the training or the license to do this. And same thing. So a really good example of this, and actually I think this is an example later on, is AEs, looking at AEs. Who is qualified to look at AEs and make the determination that it's an AE or an SAE? Some PIs will delegate that responsibility to a CRC. That is not an appropriate delegation to a CRC. CRCs can document that information, but it's not their responsibility, nor do they have the license or the education or the training experience to make a determination of whether that AE is related or possibly related. That is made by the PI. So that's not something that can be delegated to a CRC. Okay, I'm not going to read over this, but this is from the FDA. What is appropriate delegation of study-related tasks? Again, this has to be delegated by two qualified individuals, and qualification is education, training, and experience, state licensure where relevant to perform a delegated task. During inspections of investigation sites, the FDA has identified instances in which study-related tasks have been delegated to individuals that are lacking appropriate qualifications. So I listed a handful of these. Screening evaluations, including obtaining medical histories and assessment of inclusion/exclusion criteria. Sorry, I'm just seeing a question in the chat from Carlos. Can a CRM make that determination? No, unless they have a medical license. They can provide input, right? Experience is really important, right? If you've been working in clinical research as long as Leonard has, I mean, Leonard's input is important, but he cannot be delegated that responsibility. He cannot be delegated that task. It really has to fall to an individual who has the medical clinical knowledge to make that determination. Yes, yeah. Okay, so back to these kind of common findings from investigative inspections by the FDA. So physical examinations have been done or delegated to someone who doesn't have a license to do so. Determining eligibility. So looking at screening evaluations, that is not something that can be delegated to a CRC or really other members of the research team. Someone who maybe has an advanced practice license. So it depends on the situation. But for instance, a nurse practitioner or PA they can be delegated a physical examination. And it also depends on how the protocol is written. There's a difference between a physical examination and another term. So physical examinations have to be done by someone with a medical license. So a nurse practitioner, a PA, an MD, nurses, RNs can perform, and I can't think of the word right now. So if someone can put it in the chat, it is a physical assessment. That can be done by an RN. So again, it depends on the protocol and what is written in the protocol. But if it's an examination, it has to be done by someone with a license. Evaluation of adverse events, as I mentioned, assessments of primary study endpoints. This has to be done by someone who has the clinical expertise and license. And then obtaining informed consent. The PI cannot just delegate this to anybody. Really, informed consent really requires adequate training and someone with, some experience to do so. Maybe you're new to consent, but you should undergo training and obviously have that documented. Veronica asked, symptomatic PE, I'm assuming a pulmonary embolus. I'll wait for you to respond. Other important study-related tests. I mentioned determining protocol eligibility. Again, the CRC can review documents in the electronic health record and say to the PI, I think this person is eligible. But again, the CRC can't make that determination. That falls to the PI. Safety information, right? This has to do really with AEs. This falls to the PI. Ensuring the IP is secure and controlled access plan is followed. Depending on who's involved, if the investigational pharmacist is involved, this would fall to the investigational pharmacist. But if a CRC is the one who is maintaining those records, then it would be the CRC. But again, you have to document that training has been done, that you have a controlled access plan in place. Same thing with dispensation, transportation, administration of the product. Okay, back to Veronica's question. I was wondering if you were referring to a symptom-based assessment exam as opposed to a physical exam. So, right, if it's stated in the protocol as a physical examination, that has to be done by someone with a medical license. But if it's something that is an assessment, and that's, again, this is protocol dependent, but oftentimes an assessment can be done by an RN. I think we've kind of talked about this. I'm going to skip over this because I think we've covered what's listed in the delegation of authority. Here are some best practices. I want to make sure we have enough time. These are important. These are important best practices to follow. So make sure that your responsibilities header is a reflection of the study specific needs. So if that needs to change from study to study, you should, either that's coming from the sponsor, or you should have a template, but making sure that all of those headers are accurate. Examples are signing the CRFs and reviewing or signing laboratory reports. Each study staff member listed should initial and sign that line to indicate that their understanding of the task that's been delegated to them. The site PI should initial and date each line of the DOA. The PI signature at the bottom of each form is required at the conclusion of the study, but they should mark that they should initial and date that, yes, I agree with, Kiera's assessment that Leonard can do X, Y, and Z. If I'm the CRC completing the DOA. Update the log as needed following any change in study site personnel. This is a big finding when people leave a study, right? So making sure that if you are moving on to another position or another job and you're leaving the study, make sure that you fill out your stop date, because this is a big finding on DOAs. It's a very easy thing to do, to forget to put a stop date of your involvement in the study, as well as adding new people, right? So if Joaquin came in and started working on a study, he would need to obviously be delegated those responsibilities and listed on the DOA with a start date. So making sure that those changes are reflected on in each study that the CRC is coming on to. Number each page and maintain this log in the essential documents binder behind the DOA tab. This may be also, there's synonyms for the binder, right? It's investigator binder, reg binder, investigator site file or study file. Store pages in reverse chronological order with the newest pages of the log placed at the front. So when a monitor or auditor comes, they're looking at the most recent information and then they can go back. And then at the conclusion of the study, identify the final page. So you have 1 of 10, and this is your last page, 10 of 10. By check, and then so mark the last page, but also make sure there's a little box at the bottom of the DOA, which clarifies that this is the last page, so make sure that that is checked. I see a couple questions in the chat. See, an electronic signature initials acceptable? Yes, they are. I would actually strongly encourage you all to use Adobe Sign for this purpose. You can use it for training. You can use it for DOA. You can use it for a lot of different things. So yes, electronic, but it has to be something that's, well, I'm trying to think now. It has to be Part 11 compliant. Just making sure you're using a system that's Part 11 compliant.
And yeah, and sorry to interject. And absolutely, and that system actually has to be validated, as Kiera mentioned, in accordance to that regulation. So early on in our pandemic, right, we had to come up with a workaround because our Adobe Sign wasn't truly validated until I want to say 1.5 years into the process.
And then let's see, Karen said, I worked with a team recently who is not having their delegated members initial and sign because it's a best practice and no further requirement from the FDA. They're keeping a signature list to provide with the delegation authority in place to avoid members signing multiple logs. What are your thoughts? I mean, my thoughts on this slide about a best practice, because it shows that people understand what they've been delegated, that they agree, and the PI agrees as well. So that's my thought, is my best practice. I think more attention should be paid to this document if people aren't paying attention to this document, because it shows who's responsible for this all study related procedures. So my thought is that it should be initialed by the PI and it should be signed by anybody who's involved in the study.
Absolutely. And if I could add to that answer for Karen as well. So from a monitoring perspective, especially when we're kind of looking at, again, making sure we're maintaining compliance, right? The DOA that Kiera is referring to, it's a living document, okay? That should be revised. What gets problemsome and why we often refer to when we look at these types of best practices to maintain that single document, it should be a single document. Where people get in trouble, where sites get in trouble, is when we try to keep multiple things and try to keep attached, because as you know, from this field, a lot of people can leave, move to other studies, things of that nature. And if you have 2 documents, oftentimes you'll start to see incongruencies. And most people, if they are there and actually could have followed the thread of having these 2 separate documents and knowing what those incongruencies were and how they originated, but often the case, people are trying to have to piece those 2 things together. And then ultimately, there's no explanation for why we're keeping 2 separate things.
So Susan, if you can launch the next poll, we kind of just went over this, but does the PI need to sign the delegation of authority log? And the answer, of course, is yes. And then, yeah, we can end that one and go on to the next one. Thank you. Okay, so when is a delegation of authority log required? All types of research, only FDA regulated research, all types of clinical research. And let's see, sorry. So I think this one is just anytime. Scratch this part out. Only anytime documentation is needed to show appropriate delegation of study tasks has occurred.
Should I move to the next question?
Just give people just another couple seconds. So yeah, this, I need to, maybe I need to do a better job of writing these questions. These are actually harder than you would think to write accurate questions. The correct is really like A and C here. It is, you should have a delegation authority log for all types of clinical research. And then obviously anytime you're needing to document who is responsible for the delegated task. So apologies for that kind of confusing question, but A and C are both correct. Okay. Let's go on to the next one. What is the primary purpose of the DOA log? Are we documenting team training? Are we documenting team qualifications, responsibilities delegated to research team members, or document the PI responsibilities only? While you guys are answering this, I'm gonna respond to Olivia's comment here about Adobe Sign is difficult. Oh, sorry, Leonard already did. Can be difficult, especially with eDocs. All the new page. Yeah, I would still say that. I mean, even if it's signed in Adobe Sign, that doesn't mean you can't upload it again and re-sign it at a different time. I mean, you can still do that electronically. It does, just because it's signed once, obviously, right? It doesn't mean that it can't be signed again. So it's really up to you about how you want to manage that, or what your division does, or if you have an SOP around that. So yeah, 91% of you got it right. Document responsibilities delegated to research team members. And what about this question? Let's see, here we go. Which research team members can delegate responsibilities to other research team members? Yeah, this one's most people are getting it right. Or just in the interest of time, I think we'll move on. But yes, it is the PI. So the PI responsible for the whole study is the person who can delegate to study team members. And then I think I have just two more before we move on, which let's see. So let's put these in the chat. Name a couple, doesn't necessarily have to be four, but name a couple responsibilities that can be delegated to a clinical research coordinator. Or even raise your hand if you want to take yourself off mute and respond. Kelly, yes, we said consenting earlier. Get signatures for the DOA. Sure, I don't know if that's necessarily going to be on specifically on the delegation of authority log. Data entry, management of enrollment log, sure. Some training, perhaps, maybe. Entering data into the EDC. Completion of a DOA, consenting, pre-screening. IRB submissions, CRF completion, regulatory, conducting subject visits, collecting surveys. Yeah. Communication with the sponsor, sure. We're going to go over a few more as well. So this is just an example of what a DOA looks like. Obviously, I did this in PowerPoint, but you can see that the name of each member, who they are in the study, their start date, their end date, and then what their responsibilities are. Typically, you'll see, actually I have that on the next slide, but I wanted to bring it back to this signature. So I probably should have put another column here for PI initials and PI date, or even over here. But each member, right, should sign, yes, you know, my name's Kiera Davis, I signed to XYZ on the DOA, and I have signed that and I have dated it. So I should have added a couple more columns here now that we're talking about it. But here's the NIH template for a DOA. So you can see name, study role, and their signature, and then the PI's initials I guess this might be. Their initials as well, but this is just one example. Investigator signature is on the bottom here. And this is saying that I certify that the above individuals are appropriately trained, have read the protocol, and are familiar with the Code of Federal Regulations. Does someone have a question?
Yeah, hi, Kiera. This is Patty. I'm from Inpatient Clinical Trials. And so I was just having a conversation with LV about some things. And one of the things that has come up is the, I don't know, whether responsibility or delegation to a CRC to administer a study medication to a patient. And so, you know, I'm not familiar with that being done. You know, I was at City of Hope in the research department, and that was something that was not done.
Yeah.
And because I assumed that you had to have a license to be able to administer medications.
So there are differences, Patty, in the university versus the hospital. So if a patient is inpatient, I can't even go into a hospital if I'm a nurse and administer a study medication to an inpatient
patient
participant,
Mhm.
because I don't work at the hospital. So
Right,
there
exactly.
are definitely differences between SHC and Stanford University.
Okay.
So Stanford University or SHC does not allow that. A CRC cannot be delegated that task in an inpatient environment.
Okay.
Yeah, and Patty Jo, I mean, I'll even add to that, just from our emergency, medicine, I think I see one or two coordinators as well. Kiera's absolutely right. I mean, even some of these simple things for some study assessments that may, in previous institutions and or in other areas where a coordinator might be able to handle, like say, for example, something as simple as maybe doing a 12-lead EKG, right? That is off limits for us. It really involves the any type of clinical team member to do that for us. So yeah, there's a lot of big differences between university and SHC.
Yep.
So that explains why they can come over and ensure that the EKG is done, but they cannot do it themselves in the hospital.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's really a lot of almost everything in an inpatient environment. The university staff cannot come into that environment and do anything. Yeah, good question. So this is just an example of some of the study related tasks that we just kind of went over. And this is taken actually directly from an example, an actual template for the DOA. This next slide is if your PI is needing help making a determination on how to properly delegate, this is a great tool. There are just 8 questions. Show this to your PI if he or she is having, questions about, can my CRC do this? This tool may be really helpful, and it's also certainly something that you all can review as well. Just in the interest of time, I'm gonna go through. Keep going. So I wish we had time for this. Maybe in the future we can do this for 2 hours, because I do think this is a great activity, but this is definitely something that you can practice and discuss with your colleagues. But this is an activity where you place an X next to the study activity and who can be delegated that responsibility. And again, just in the interest of time, let's see, I guess we only have a couple more slides to go through, so I think we're okay. So discuss with a partner, which we won't do for purpose of time, but who's responsible for identifying AEs, who can determine relatedness and expectedness of AEs, and you can put that in the chat. Yeah, exactly. Everybody's saying PI, exactly. So again, CRCs can document AEs, right? They can take notes on that. They can talk with the PI about it. But when it comes to understanding that clinical information around an AE, whether it's related or expected, how severe it is, that is all the responsibility of the PI for sure. Okay, let's talk very briefly about team training. We've talked about this a little bit throughout the presentation today. So all team members need to be informed and trained on the protocol, the purpose of the study, the research hypothesis, what the research interventions are, what the study endpoints are, how the investigational product will be controlled, and any information around how to keep that product safe. So, right, if there are temperature issues or, you know, light issues, if you have to keep the bottle in, or the medication or the drug in some sort of special bottle because of light. And then they should be well informed about GCP and obviously regulatory requirements. And then, just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to talk about documentation of training. So again, I've mentioned this a lot. It's super important to document all of your training. So today, when you finish this class, keeping track of this information is really important for purposes of documentation of training. So formal training, like your city training is important, but also classes like this are really important. If you attend any research meetings or conferences, protocol training, including any amendments, informed consent training I've mentioned. Again, earlier I talked about study-related procedures. So if you have been delegated collection of vital signs, you should have documented training that you underwent training on how to collect vital signs appropriately, right? If you're asked to collect respiratory rate, how were you trained on that, and who did the training? Document protocol version, date and time, and then the team members in attendance, as well as who gave the training. When new information is made available, new training should also take place, right? So if there's a change to the protocol, new documentation on new training and on that new protocol should take place. All right, for the last few slides, I'll turn it back over to Leonard here.
Thanks, Kiera. So I know in the interest of time, I have about 6 slides left, but I'll just kind of gloss over this, just get to some of the case studies, but hopefully I'll just put a nice bow on all of our discussion points here, especially when we're referring to the topic of investigator and or CRC and responsibilities. Because, I think the inherent question that comes up whenever we start talking about responsibilities, who's responsible for this, or can we delegate that? Oftentimes what we're really looking for, and again, when we look at GCP, I mean, we're talking about ethics, we're talking about good quality data, right? What you'll see on the FDA website, if you Google this, I will just discuss in one of the reasons why we want to detail this information out on who's responsible for what, because in most clinical investigations here, there are a number of non-compliance issues, right? And if you look at these next slides, and I will not belabor the points and go over these and read these to you, but look at the highlighted bullet or the big bullet points here. These traditionally are like the top 10. They can rank in various orders. Throughout the FDA actually keeps a running list. They'll come out with like the top 10 findings that they might have every single year. And oftentimes these are just kind of shuffled around, right? So it is failure to follow the protocol or investigational plan, inadequate or inaccurate records, drug accountability is lacking, failure to obtain or document the subject's consent, or inadequate like consent forms, information missing, things of that nature. Also, lack of investigator involvement or oversight. That's usually a big one as well. Good documentation practice, right? When there's, especially when we're talking about R2 now, when we're really looking at the addendum and trying to adopt those for like electronic systems that are being brought into into clinical research versus, the old school method of like a lot of paper things, obviously looking at like, audit trails and things of that nature, problems with IRB approval, and especially when it pertains to potentially starting a clinical investigation before or doing activities before you get an approval, and failure to record AEs and or to report those appropriately. Okay, so what are some of these consequences of noncompliance? Well, obviously, it deals directly with participant safety. Some of those, things could obviously mean financial loss, and as we'll see here in a couple of these case studies, it actually will happen. You will actually come up with bad data, right? Invalid or questionable study data. Oftentimes, if you're an investigator and even CRC, as you'll see later, your professional and reputation might be at risk. You might get suspended or terminated, and to the highest extent, if you broke federal law, obviously prosecuted. So here's some examples of some of these non-compliance in human subjects research that have happened in the past. And it's interesting because when we talk about like our history and when we throw out these big name documents, right? Or we look about or go back to the history, say like Declaration of Helsinki, Tuskegee experiments and things of that nature. Well, guess what? These all happen, in about the last 10 or 20 years, okay? Look at the top one, right? This was an actual CRC convicted of 3 felonies and disbarred by the FDA. Why? Because this person basically ran his study without much of the knowledge of the PI. So as you can see there, some of the impact, he just enrolled ineligible patients, there was multiple deaths, and guess what? Multiple researchers, meaning physicians, were dismissed. If you look at the last one, right? This patient was essentially ineligible. It was a gene therapy program was shut down. The investigator was restricted from human subjects for 5 years. And look at the last couple parts. The institution had to pay the federal government over $500K. And guess what? Federal funding for all human subjects research at the institution was suspended temporarily. Okay, so that's the type of impact and why when we really want to discuss as far as GCPs and roles of investigators, and because everybody to a person that's on this call, again, whether you're running a clinical investigator and or responsible to a PI, primarily, obviously, we're all a part of resolving and or maintaining compliance to any type of clinical research plan and or to the regs and or to any guidance, right? So here's a simple case study, and I'll let you know some of these things, again, some of these obviously parameters were changed, but these things actually occurred to, if you're from SCCR, one of our former SCCR colleagues, right? So here was an actual study. There was basically within the protocol, they really discussed that there was limited safety data on the drug that was under investigation, right? The FDA approved the protocol with these parameters. Now we had 2 people present with this, okay, with 5 times the upper limit of normal for this liver enzyme, right? So quickly, just through the chat, would you guys enroll this person? Yeah, absolutely. A lot of no's, but guess what? Here's what actually happened. The PI of that study instructed the CRC to enroll. Basically, even though the CRC had escalated it up through our quality and compliance group, basically the PI had texted back to that person and said, yep, don't really care what they say. But here's where you and CRC can actually come, heads along into like maintaining compliance to the protocol, right? They weren't enrolled because the CRC escalated those issues and eventually just stopped enrollment, right? So they didn't proceed, and that was the right course of action. Case study 2, right? This actually happened recently. So here was an electronic case report form. At the end of the form, there's 2 signature fields, right? One for the individual who completed the form and other for the investigator to verify all the data that was entered, okay? The requirement is to capture the signature, is to type, it means simply, there wasn't any Adobe sign, it's just simply to type your name and that qualifies. So one of the parameters is that of the system of the EDC, that the CRC and the investigator both have separate access and or logins, okay? So for all of you, what would be the most appropriate practice in accordance with GCP to capture the signatures? And for this one, please just come off mute and just blurt those questions or those answers out. What do you think would be best practice for this? Anyone? Okay. Yep. We have a call for a wet signature, but be mindful again, this is all EM-CRUs. No one?
Hi, this is Monica.
Yeah, Monica, thank you.
Yeah, just jumping in since the PI would have their own login credentials, and the PI can just log in and enter their name, even though it's just a typed signature. Since once they log in, they'll have that track in the system that the PI was the one to enter their name.
Absolutely. So therefore, there would be, collaboration with the PI, meaning the CRC can complete all the data on that form, types their name in for the person who completes it, and asks the PI, hey, can you log in to this form? I just completed it, and type your name in there. And why? Because essentially, again, when I mentioned this, why I mentioned proposed best practice, because you can kind of go multiple ways here, right? But it really requires, outside of what we're presenting here on the slide deck, it really does involve some additional documentation if the coordinator is going to, quote unquote, be delegated that responsibility for typing in. Because within any electronic data capture system these days, right, there's an audit trail. So you can clearly see if a CRC typed in both names versus if an investigator actually logged in and typed their own name there. Okay. Any questions, concerns, comments? Okay, I'll stop sharing. All right, that ends our presentation today. And I think we're right on time, if not a little, just 1 minute over. But any questions from anybody on the call today?
Thank you so much, Leonard and Kiera. We really appreciate your time and expertise. This was a very informative presentation. Yeah, please unmute yourself if you have any questions. Otherwise, we know we are at time, so feel free to log off, and I will send out the email with the slides and the evaluation. Please make sure you complete that to provide us your feedback. I also put the evaluation link in the chats in case you are still on the call. But thank you so much. Really appreciate it. The recording also will be available within a couple of days. I'll stop recording now.